I want to tell you about the worst tomato year I ever had. It was 1,997. I had 14 acres in vegetables, same as I do now, and I'd planted 6 of them in a heritage beefsteak variety that I'd been growing for 11 years. Beautiful fruit. Dense, meaty, late-season producer. I knew that crop the way you know something you've grown from seed every spring for over a decade. That year, they came up right. They set flowers right. And then, somewhere in late July, the whole thing just stalled. Growth slowed. New tissue came in pale. The growing tips looked pinched. I lost 40% of that planting. And I spent the rest of that season, and most of the following 2 years, blaming every wrong thing: the heat, the irrigation schedule, a nitrogen imbalance I could never quite prove. I was troubleshooting from an incomplete list. I just didn't know it yet. I've been farming this same ground in central Illinois since 1983. 80 acres total. 14 in market. Vegetables, tomatoes, winter squash, dry beans, garlic, sweet corn. 42 seasons. I've had years where everything came together and years that humbled me down to nothing. I've sat through more extension service meetings than I can count. I've read the bulletins. I've done the soil tests. What I'm about to tell you is the thing that none of those sources ever put on my radar, and it cost me close to a decade of subpar yields before I found it. It'll cost you $15 to verify. Pay attention. Every spring for the first 20-odd years, I ran the same routine. pH test. Lime if it needed adjusting. NPK fertilizer worked into the beds. Compost top dress. Then plant and wait. I thought I was doing it right. The numbers looked right. Yields were decent, not what I expected from the soil I was working, but decent. I called that farming. What I was actually doing was managing a partial list and calling it complete. The NPK framework, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, was built around what plants consume in the largest quantities. That's the logic of it, and those nutrients matter. I'm not standing here telling you to throw out your soil test or stop managing nitrogen. But here's what those 20 years of decent but not great harvests eventually taught me. NPK is the gasoline and the engine oil. It doesn't tell you why the alternator is dead. And if the alternator is dead, you can pour gas into that engine all season long and the car won't start. What nobody had ever put on my diagnostic list, what I never heard at a single extension meeting in 42 years of farming, was copper. Not as a fertilizer, not as an amendment you dump into beds by the bag, as a trace mineral that controls 2 of the most fundamental enzyme systems in plant biology. Systems that were running below capacity in my beds for close to 2 decades, and that I had no idea to look for because the framework I was given never mentioned them. So let me tell you what copper is actually doing underground. Not the old farmer's folklore version, though we'll get to that, and it turns out they weren't wrong. The biological version. The measurable chemistry. Copper is what's called a cofactor, a non-protein molecule that a specific enzyme requires to function. Not to function well, to function at all. Pull the cofactor below the threshold that enzyme needs, and the enzyme stops. Completely. Not slows down. Stops. 2 critical enzyme systems in plant biology are copper-dependent. The first one is called plastocyanin. Here's what that means in plain language. When a plant captures light and runs photosynthesis, the energy from that light gets converted into chemical energy through a chain of electron transfers. Plastocyanin is the carrier molecule in that chain. It picks up an electron at one end of the photosystem and delivers it to the next stage of the reaction. It's a courier, and it cannot do that job without copper. Drop copper availability below the threshold this enzyme needs, and the electron transport chain stalls. Your plant is sitting in full July sun on a southern exposure with every pound of nitrogen you've ever put in that bed, and it is running at a fraction of its photosynthetic capacity because the courier in its energy system is grounded. I think about that now when I walk my squash rows in midsummer, big healthy-looking vines, good leaf color on the older tissue, everything seeming fine, and the growth rate just not pushing the way it should. I blamed the heat for a lot of those seasons. I blamed the variety. I was looking at everything except the enzyme systems. The second is called cytochrome oxidase. This one sits at the end of the cellular respiration chain, the process that converts stored sugars into ATP, which is the fuel that drives cell division, root growth, and new tissue development. Cytochrome oxidase is the final enzyme in that chain. It completes the reaction, and it's also copper-dependent. When copper availability drops below what this enzyme requires, ATP production slows. Cell division slows with it. Root tips push out more slowly. New tissue develops more slowly. The plant doesn't look sick. It doesn't look deficient in any way that shows up on your standard test panel. It just runs at 60 or 70% of its biological potential because one small cofactor is missing from two systems that can't work without it. And here's the thing that makes this so hard to catch. Copper-deficient plants don't collapse. They don't yellow out or show the dramatic symptoms that a nitrogen crash shows you. They look slightly off. Growth a little slower than it should be. New leaves a touch pale. Growing tips that look slightly pinched or distorted before the rest of the plant does. Lateral branching. That's just a little slower to push. In garlic and onions, new shoots that twist or don't fully extend. You've seen that in your beds. I saw it in mine. And I called it something else every single time. Heat stress, inconsistent moisture, a nitrogen flush that hadn't resolved yet. I wasn't wrong to troubleshoot. I was troubleshooting from an incomplete list. Now here's where the copper story picks up another layer, because the enzyme chemistry is only part of what's happening underground. Your soil, if it's healthy, has a fungal network running through it, mycorrhizal fungi. Hair-thin filaments extending through the soil, connecting plant root systems to mineral and water sources the roots themselves can't physically reach. A healthy mycorrhizal network expands the effective root access of every plant in your bed by a factor of 10 to 100, not 10%, 10 times. The difference between a plant pulling from a 12-inch radius and one drawing from 6 feet of soil in every direction. Copper regulates that network. At trace concentrations, parts per million in bioavailable form, copper stimulates hyphal growth and increases the density of the network. The grid runs faster. Nutrient transfer speeds up. Plants that already have better enzyme function also get access to a wider mineral supply chain at the same time. But here's the trap, and this is the part I want you to hear carefully. At elevated concentrations, that same copper that was accelerating the network begins destroying it. Excess copper is fungicidal. The hyphae start dying back. The network that was doing 10 times the work of your plant's roots collapses. You've turned an amplifier into a poison. This is not like managing nitrogen, where more is roughly better until you hit burn. This is a signal system. Too little and the grid runs at reduced capacity. Too much, and you've shorted it out. The old instinct to add more of something that's working is the single most dangerous mistake you can make with trace minerals. Now the old farmers, the ones burying copper wire, copper tools, copper implements beneath their most productive beds. French vignerons in Burgundy who noticed that plots with old copper tools left in the root zones were producing denser, more disease-resistant fruit. Andean farmers coiling copper wire around seed tubers before planting potatoes in new ground. English kitchen gardeners keeping records of beds where copper cookware had been buried during soil-building years, and those beds outperforming everything around them for decades. No one had a laboratory explanation. What they had was generations of careful observation, the same thing that's driven farming knowledge since before any of us were here. In 1885, a French botanist named Millardet accidentally proved what those farmers had been watching. He noticed that vines sprayed with copper sulfate and lime applied to roadside rows to make fruit look unpalatable and deter theft were growing measurably stronger and healthier than untreated vines. He formalized it, published it, and proved the mechanism. The copper those old farmers were burying was doing what copper does, keeping plastocyanin and cytochrome oxidase supplied with the cofactor those enzymes cannot work without. They didn't know the names. They knew the results. 2 centuries of observation before anyone handed it a chemical explanation. Here's where this becomes practical. Copper deficiency is more common in modern garden and small farm beds than the mainstream framework suggests. Sandy soils lose it fast, it leaches with drainage water. High pH soils above 7.5 reduce copper solubility, meaning copper may technically be present, but locked in forms plant roots cannot take up. And peat-heavy growing mixes the standard base for most bagged raised bed blends. And potting soils have high organic matter content that binds copper tightly and strips it from bioavailable forms. If you've built raised beds on a peat, perlite, and compost blend, your copper availability may be borderline or deficient right now, and your standard test panel will not show it. The dose problem means you start with a test, not a standard macronutrient panel that won't include copper. You need a micronutrient panel. It costs roughly what one bag of fertilizer costs. If your copper reads below 1 part per million in available form, you have a confirmed reason to act. If it reads in the normal range, you don't. That's the step those old farmers couldn't take. You can. Take it before you do anything else. If your test confirms low copper, the lowest risk approach is building copper-accumulating companion plants into your beds. Yarrow, comfrey, and stinging nettle draw copper from deeper soil layers and release it at the surface through leaf drop and root exudates. I run comfrey borders on every bed section now. One plant chopped and dropped through the season continuously deposits trace minerals right where your crops are rooting, not flooding. Metering. That's what those buried copper tools were doing. Metering through slow oxidation, not flooding. The old farmers who got results were the conservative ones. Small pieces, specific locations. Watched over years. For containers, a diluted copper sulfate solution applied once at the start of the season will correct a confirmed deficiency without approaching toxic levels. At label rates, not more. And not without the test first, because in a container, excess copper has nowhere to go. I went back through my field journals after I figured this out. 1997, the year I lost 40% of my beefsteak planting, I just rebuilt those beds with a fresh peat-based blend. New raised sections, high organic matter, everything I thought I was doing right. What I'd done, without knowing it, was create exactly the conditions for copper to bind out of bioavailability, right at the root zone of the crop I was most counting on. It took me 25 years to put that together. You don't have to wait 25 years. Test the soil. Look at the young tissue. Watch for the tips, the curl, the slow lateral branching. Put copper on your diagnostic list, where it should have been all along. 42 seasons on the same ground. The soil has more patience than I do, but it's been trying to tell me things the whole time. Most of the time, I was listening for the wrong words.